all those involved and overall protect life and property in the region. This is not unique, although it is, something new for this part of the state. We're taking steps now because we want to use this moment to understand the series of decisions that may need to be made as the water comes down the hill. So, using the best available science and technology, and our colleagues at D.W.R. Have really evolved the work that they've done over the past 40 years, which is really the last time that we had a disaster like this. And so we want to really give our local first responders the best available information so they can understand where are the risks, where's the water going to go, what's the volume of the water, so that when we're in these emergency life or death situations, we can make timely decisions that are informed by science and that hopefully keep as many folks safe as possible. There are thousands of state personnel already on the ground all across our state, but particularly in the southern San Joaquin Valley, working to support the communities. When I say support, we are not just in a preparedness mode for what happens next, we're also simultaneously responding to the flooding disaster that's already happened. And so there's disaster recovery centers for people who have been, flooded. There's FEMA assistance available. So we're preparing for floods to come, responding to flooding that's happening now. And there is active flooding in the region, as you've well documented in your media stories. And then recovering from what's come so far. So really, we're in all three phases of a disaster process simultaneously, sometimes in the same county. And so that certainly makes for a complex and challenging moment, but something that we take seriously as we move forward, because this is very unique in the history of our state. As many of you know and have covered, on April 3rd, the White House approved California's request for a presidential major disaster declaration, which opens up assistance for response and recovery, which includes individual assistance for many of those who are displaced by the flooding all across the state. It also includes public assistance to help state, tribal, and local governments rebuild following their impacts. So that's things like roads, bridges, courthouses, in some cases, schools. The governor's also signed an emergency declaration, which cuts red tape and streamlines the ability of the state to respond. He signed that on March 31st. And so that gives additional flexibility and authorities to local responders, state responders here.
I'm on a call now, as soon as this is over.
Brian May, please mute yourself. That continues to give a variety of support. And so even as California continues to experience great weather, we're very much looking at what needs to happen over the coming days and weeks to protect these communities with an eye towards critical infrastructure. So what are the sites? Is there wastewater treatment plants? Is there hospitals, nursing homes, other critical infrastructure? Many of you have written about the prison at Corcoran, and there's additional infrastructure behind there too. So we want to map those risks now so that we can prepare our response in such a way that we can mitigate the impacts on any areas that could be adversely impacted. So, certainly want to leave you with that we are going to have a challenging few weeks to come. But, one of the things that we continue to be impressed with is that the ability of Californians to come together during these challenging times. And, we want to work closely to help the most vulnerable members of our communities who we know are disproportionately impacted by disasters. So bringing support in a meaningful way to individuals, families, communities who are impacted. Our hope is that they don't need that support, that we're able to mitigate the impacts. But looking forward, we want to really have an eye towards helping as many Californians as possible during this challenging time. I'll turn it back over to my colleagues at D.W.R. and be available to respond to questions at the end of the meeting.
Thanks so much, Brian. So we do have two presentations on the latest conditions and efforts towards groundwater recharge and flood planning. As Brian said, we'll be focusing on the science behind it and the data that we're using to support those local counties with their decision-making process. We will take questions following the presentations. If you're a member of the media, please change your screen name to show what outlet you're with, and that'll help us call on you. If you do have a question, we'll be utilizing the hand raise feature on a first-come, first-served basis. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Michael Anderson, D.W.R.'s state climatologist. Dr. Anderson.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Let's go to the next slide. All right, just start with a 90-day outlook from our colleagues at NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, showing you that for right now they have no notion other than climatology to guide what happens in California throughout the rest of the spring. And this happens often when we are in transition from a La Nina to an El Nino event, more apparently neutral conditions that we find ourselves in now. Let's go to the next slide. All right, but looking more closely into the coming week, we work with our friends, National Weather Service and the California Nevada River Forecast Center. On the right, showing freezing elevations for about midday on Thursday, the 27th, and you see that we get into elevations over 13,000 feet, meaning we will see melt happening up towards the top of the watersheds. On the left-hand side, we have our minimum temperature forecast for Friday morning. And we see that the minimums are in the upper 50s, low 60s, and the departures there about 10 degrees above average for this time of year. So towards the end of the week, we're going to see things warm up. And with that warm up comes more snowmelt. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about the keys to snowmelt. One, there are physical limits to how much snow melts in a day. It's controlled by the sun angle, the length of the day, and how much radiation actually makes it into the pack to change the snow from its solid state into its liquid state. And then those minimum temperatures control that freeze-thaw pattern that causes the fluctuation in runoff. So we'll see that fluctuation decrease a little bit as we get later into the week, as there's less freezing except at the highest elevations. Did want to talk about the distribution of snow on the mountain and taking a product from our new work with the aerial remote sensing of snow in partnership with ASO, where this is from the San Joaquin Basin and showing from January, mid-March, and mid-April here, kind of the evolution of the pack by elevation. And so we really see that now here in April, the lower elevation stuff around 4,000 feet, that's gone. But we've seen a growth up around 10,000 feet of the snowpack into mid-April as we've had those little scattered waves move through and deposit a little more snow at the highest elevations. This helps us understand where we have snow and how much exposure it has to that sun and how ready it is to melt. Let's go to the next slide. Now we'll kind of pivot over into the response and planning activities that we've been doing. So we can go to the next slide. Start with our friends at California Nevada River Forecast Center Forecast Map, and it's been updated since here to reflect the warm-up that we're expecting later in the week. We do have a few more flood points, one at Yosemite, at Pohono Bridge, and then over on the east slope this year at Gardnerville. We'll monitor stages. So lower San Joaquin, as you see, a little cluster of orange dots remains at monitor stage. And again, just to note, there are no official forecast points for the Tulare Lake bed. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. So let's look at this in how we organize the response. And our team's working in partnership with Corps of Engineers and our other partners. And we start with the snowmelt tracking. We have weekly briefings that look with our local partners to see what we're seeing, how that's working in terms of the melt coming into the reservoirs. That water coming into the reservoirs works with our coordinated operations team that looks to see the different melt patterns and how that has to be managed through the reservoirs into a release schedule that the Corps of Engineers will then set for the reservoirs. Work our way through the kind of riverine system between those reservoirs and the lake bed. And our floodplain teams have some modeling that we work in partnership with the Corps to do some modeling there to identify where we might have concerns. Now, all this work supports local response, and remember, all emergencies start locally. And it's that coordination from local, state, and federal that really enables the best emergency response to happen. And so working with the counties, we then coordinate with the department's Flood Operations Center and with the State Operations Center with the Office of Emergency Services, we can get that response lined up and executed. Let's go to the next slide. Alrighty, so the tools that we have. Well, our Snowmelt runoff, we use our Bulletin 120 monthly reports. We also have weekly updates that give us a sense of that pace and timing of the runoff and what volume of water we're expecting. We also work with our partners at the California Nevada River Forecast Center for weather information. As I mentioned, the floodplain teams modelers are working with river models as well as a computer model of water movement across the lake bed to identify those areas that might be potential flood concerns and relate that information to the county. It also enables the county to communicate where they'd like to see some additional intel. And that modeling can be provided for them. Also, we did one other thing. I'll talk to you about this in a little bit here, is really looking at, without a lot of information from our local partners, as they'd like to keep that information pretty close. We produced a range of water volumes that, how that would cover the lake bed, given that you don't have any information about diversions or any levee actions. And we created an atlas that shows at different depths of water, different volumes of water, what depth that is and how much space it covers. And refer to that as the Tulare Lake Atlas. Let's go to the next slide. All right, that atlas, it's really an assessment of volume of water on the terrain. Really is to help just guide flood awareness. Given that there is not information readily coming from the locals, it allows the locals then to look and see what happens if water were just to be left to accumulate at the lowest points. That hopefully helps guide them in their decisions that they make and how they manipulate water across the landscape and work with the other actions that we'll talk about here in a little bit to mitigate how much water actually makes it onto the lake bed. Let's go to the next slide. So here's an example, and the image here shows at 1 million acre feet of water and get a water surface elevation of 184 feet above sea level. Lake bed elevation is 170. So does not consider any actions to deal with water. It just says if 1 million acre feet of water ended up at the bottom of the lake bed based on our LIDAR survey in 2021, this is what would happen. Gives a sense of the extent of the flooding and highlights areas that need response measures to change the outcomes. So the atlas has elevations mapped from 171 to 200 feet of elevation. It's mapped in 1 foot increments, and this is again made available to the locals to help them in their planning. Let's go to the next slide. All right, here's an example of kind of output you get from those Riverine models that we work with in partnership with the Corps. Take a reservoir release and then run it through the computer model, which models the flow of the water through the channels, identifies any areas where you might have water going out of channel and potentially into communities. And the local counties can request specific scenarios be run if they have concerns about a particular community. Next slide. All right, that's it for me. So hand it off to Paul Gosselin to talk about the groundwater recharge work.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Paul Gosselin. I'm Deputy Director at D.W.R for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office. What I'm going to talk to you about is some of the flood diversions and groundwater recharge efforts that are going on. Next slide, please. One of the things we started, we called it the weekly runoff and recharge outreach and local assistance. And this goes up and down the central and southern San Joaquin Valley. Since the January floods, we have initiated efforts to contact and coordinate with approximately 108 permitted recharge facilities and water banks, and to coordinate reservoir releases and flood releases with those entities to ensure that they're able to divert those flood flows into their recharge basins to help minimize impacts downstream. Many of these recharge basins were funded from the state as part of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and others. But what we wanted to do is to make sure that to the maximum extent possible, these waters could be diverted off to protect communities, as well as providing some secondary groundwater recharge. Next slide. Now I'll focus on Tulare Lake. So one of the things that has really advanced efforts is the governor's executive order that came out to clarify and streamline the flood diversion process and recharge programs. So we've been working principally in Area 2 to, again, focus in on this coordination with diversions and recharge operations. So we've been doing this on a regular weekly basis and coordinating. It's not going to eliminate all the flood risk downstream, but it will minimize and actually hopefully alleviate some of the stress along the water bodies. One thing we did identify is a lot of the agencies have reached their maximum capacity for what pumps they have available. So we've initiated efforts to do what's called a temporary pump program. And what this is we're, through an emergency contract, are coordinating the access of additional pumps for these agencies to be able to utilize. Fresno Irrigation District has been the first one to take advantage of this. I think they're going to be operational today, and we're looking, we've had a great outreach from other agencies who are looking to take advantage of this. So it's really part of our coordination effort to help assist local agencies on their flood diversions. And again, hopefully going to provide some additional recharge. But again, the primary emphasis is to reduce the risk to downstream communities. To date, through the executive order, the efforts are reported to the State Water Resources Control Board. Again, this is emergency flood diversions. You don't need a water right permit, but to date, there's been approximately 55,000 acre feet since March, since the executive order went into place, and that's roughly about 55,000 acres that have been land that's been diverted. Now, the question is, we're still going to be tracking over time how much actually gets recharged. But again, that's going to take time because recharge occurs at different rates in different lands. But again, the primary emphasis is to assist those local agencies on flood diversions. With that, I can turn it back. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks, Dr. Anderson. So we are going to go ahead and open it up for questions from credentialed media. Again, we're using the hand raising function, so please utilize that, and we'll call on you in order that your hand was raised. I do want to note that we also have additional folks available for questions from the State Water Project, from the Division of Flood Management, as well as from our Snow Surveys group. So we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. We'll start with Ian James from the LA Times. Ian, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Wanted to ask about the Tulare Lake Atlas that you mentioned and the larger plan. Sorry, just getting that up here. So the Tulare Lake Atlas seems geared toward providing information that local flood control districts can use. Does the state have a plan for flood management in the basin that mitigates or prevents cities and towns from being inundated, towns like Allensworth, Alpaugh, or others?
All right, this is Mike Anderson. Hi there, Ian. In response, so the emergencies are managed locally. All emergencies are local, coordinated then through state and federal as conditions grow. We've been down, as Brian mentioned at the beginning, been down there working with them for the past month, hand in hand, to show them, introduce, ask for some data to help our tools better serve them. So it's work in progress. Locals have made it clear that they have their notion of how they want to manage this. And so we remain in support posture for them while they work through that.
All right, our next question comes from Daniel Trotta with Reuters. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. A couple of questions, if I may, and I'll sort of throw it out there for whoever may be most apt to answer. The first, just generally speaking, when looking at the state map with the expected snow melt, do we know where are the most dangerous and vulnerable places obviously we're talking about Tulare Lake. I've heard the southern San Joaquin Valley mentioned, but are there particular geographical locations where we can more easily expect there to be flooding? And then secondarily, with regard to Tulare Lake, can someone provide sort of a updated status of exactly how much of that area is covered in water, what percentage of the original lake, or how many acres or whatnot, and also is covered by water, and then also if you can give us an indication of how much of that is private land, how much is Boswell land, and how much is public land within the area that's actually submerged up to their lake. Thank you.
Mike.
Yeah, hey Ryan, I was just going to say, Daniel, we'll follow up with you with the details of those, because those will take a little penciling out to get actual numbers for you. I don't have those off the top of my head. What we've seen from the March flooding onto the lake bed is about 300,000 acres. I don't have off the top of my head the original size of Tulare Lake. I do know that it was the largest freshwater body west of the Mississippi back when it was a permanent feature on the landscape.
Is that almost all private farmland, or is there a significant portion of public land?
It is a significant portion of land held for agricultural practices. Like I said, I'll follow up with Ryan to get the amounts that are actually associated with particular landowners that you mentioned.
Thanks. And then with regard to the danger zones, can anyone address?
Oh yeah, sorry. Thank you. So let's talk about where you have different size snowpacks as well as in the infrastructure that manages them, particularly the reservoirs. And one of the spots that's often a challenge is in the San Joaquin Basin in the upper San Joaquin watershed. Fairly large space, but you get down in the reservoir that manages that is Milliton. And it's a fairly small facility, about 500,000 acre feet. Now, they do a fantastic job of moving water through that part of the Central Valley project. But when you do get into an accelerated melt in larger snowpacks, there can be time periods where they will have to exercise the release gates at the reservoir. That may lead to some localized flooding there. System-wide flooding, really, as you saw on the CNRFC webpage, looking there down in the lower San Joaquin where the accumulation of all the flows. It's an area where there's a lot of seepage. What happens there is it's usually an event by event in the levee system down there that is managed in a response function with each of those. And the department's been working closely with San Joaquin County, running all kinds of simulations on potential scenarios there, hoping to develop that relationship and capacity more so with the Tulare Lake bed counties. We have a difference because San Joaquin County has participated over the last decade in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. The Lake Bed counties declined to participate in that program.
Hey, Ryan, if I may, just because a little bit in this one, and then also to circle back to Ian's question on the first, all of this science that we're talking about on this call, all of this mapping and data that we have is really in service of triaging the emergency response and understanding our risk and steps we can take to mitigate it. And, while a lot of the conversations we're having, both with the local partners and on the call today are about, where are the levees or how do you move the water, the same subset of data also allows us to make emergency management decisions, right? Where are the areas where we should put swift water vehicles? Where is the critical infrastructure that may need to be mitigated, whether it's, something like a water treatment plant to protect that infrastructure, or a waste site like there's fertilizer, factories there. There's also certainly a lot of oil interest being in this part of the world, and so by having the same data, it allows us to kind of understand and map the risk, and also do proactive emergency response and pre-position firefighters, personnel, understand who lives there. So how many shelter beds would we need if you have to evacuate people? Where can we put the laydowns for rocks or super sacks, or what are the areas that may be at risk where you may need a helicopter to get people out? So the same subset of data that we're using to understand where the water will go also helps us understand the protective actions that could be taken to keep these communities safe. And so it's kind of a twofold effort of there's water jujitsu happening of flowing with the water to put it where it needs to be, but also at the same time, understanding what are the emergency protective measures we as a state, along with our local and federal counterparts, can do to help protect these communities. And there is so much water, as these folks are telling you, that there will not be any digging. We cannot dig our way out of this or build out of it. We just need to be smart with what are the steps we can take holistically to protect as many people as possible as we move forward.
Thanks, Brian. So our next question comes from Haley Smith with the LA Times. Go ahead, Haley.
Hi, thanks. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about reservoir operations for the coming days, specifically the ones on that map you showed. So like Lake Success, Isabella, Pine Flat, and Terminus. How full are they? What kind of releases might we be seeing as it gets warmer? Anything you can tell us about those operations?
I can do a little bit here, Haley. You can find all the information on the Corps of Engineers Sacramento District webpage as far as the current releases for each of the facilities. We're going to go through each of them because they're all very different watersheds. So we start with the Kings River. That's the largest watershed of the four, has the largest snowpack, has good reservoir, has been in flood releases here for the past month, and is currently, looking at our CDEP page, at 46% of capacity at 463,000 acre feet. It's got a capacity of 1 million. Inflows are currently 7,800 CFS, outflows at 12,500. With the heat, we'll probably see those inflows double. And it'll be up to the Corps to look at how they manage that change in inflow with any needed increases in the outflow. We get down to the Tulare River, a much smaller watershed, lower elevation, much smaller snowpack, and inflows right now are less than 1,500 CFS, and outflows are 1,300 CFS, and it's about 67%, or about 2/3 full right now. A lot of these reservoirs in this region are currently moving water out to make room for the accelerated melt being anticipated over the next week, and we'll watch that pivot happen to where they go from decreasing storage to either maintaining storage or potentially increasing. And this will be the week to follow it and follow along either on CDEC's webpage under the reservoir tab. You can find a summary of the major reservoirs, or, as I mentioned, to that Corps of Engineers Sacramento District webpage, which gives you the current releases that they have planned.
Thanks, Mike. Our next question comes from Stephanie Elam with CNN. Go ahead.
Hi there, Stephanie Elam. I have two questions. First is, I know we're talking about the Tulare Basin, but what about the rivers themselves? Are we concerned not just at the reservoir level, but about flooding along those? And then my other question is just about the groundwater recharging. I'm wondering how much subsidence is playing into that after all these years of drought. Is there still the capacity for that amount of water? And really, how long are we talking about before we see a recharge of these groundwater aquifers? Thanks.
I'll take the first one. Hi, Stephanie. It's Mike. And then I'll follow up with the groundwater piece. As far as the riverine flow, that's when I spoke about having that riverine model capability, that's looking at the potential flooding along the rivers as the water makes its way from the reservoirs downstream, either towards the lake bed or down towards the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and really look at those areas that might have a flood risk and identify the areas that may need a response measure put into place. Paul?
Thank you. The capacity in basins are pretty large. Just this past year, the year that ended in September 30th of 2022, we reported a decline in storage statewide of almost 7 million acre feet. The year before was almost a decline in storage of 8 million acre feet. So that's storage that's available in basins. So groundwater basins have a lot of storage capacity just because of how much has been exercised during the drought and over pumping. Now, for subsidence areas or areas with the subsidence, some of those compaction of the clays are not going to be real conducive to hold water. But again, where we're having the local agencies are diverting water, in many cases are established groundwater recharge basins. So they've been established, permitted, and they're pretty well understood on their capacity to recharge. There's also flood diversions on open, active ag lands that are not permitted for recharge, but they're used to divert flood flows. It's kind of uncertain as to for these areas how much, if any, is going to be recharged. Some will. Some, may just move off and eventually go back to creeks and streams. So we're going to be tracking recharge with change in storage on an annual basis. But, there is a lot of capacity in basins to recharge.
Thanks, both. All right, next question, Paul Rogers, Mercury News. Go ahead.
Hello, a couple quick questions. I think the big one is, with this warm weather coming up, are you expecting more flooding in that area that's already flooded? It doesn't look like, as Mike mentioned, from the NOAA, California River Forecast Center, that any of the rivers down there are, going to exceed their banks. So, number one, are you expecting flooding from these warm days coming up? And number two, I just want to clarify something Mike said about the question on how many acres are underwater right now there in the Tulare Lake Basin. I thought you said 300,000. The New York Times quotes the sheriff's office saying, using square feet, that there's somewhere between 65,000 and 100,000 acre feet from the Kings County Sheriff's Office. I'm sorry, 65,000 and 100,000 acres that's currently under about 3 feet of water. So was the 300,000 acres you mentioned, was that like total back in the beginning of March during the worst of the storms? Or, that question is, how many acres right now are underwater in this area? And then the first question again, what is this heat going to do? Is it going to cause more flooding? Thank you.
All right, Paul, I will have to get back to you with the right number and what it is right now. And get that also back to Ian, I believe, also asked that question. As far as your question on what happens with the heat and the warm-up, we'll see the increases in the reservoir inflows, but it's really the reservoir outflows that are going to manage the water flowing downstream. And right now, looks like the reservoirs will probably manage at the same releases they're flowing now. And then, like I say, the reservoir coordinated operations teams will look and determine if there are any increases that are needed, and then work with the downstream modelers to see what kind of impacts result from that.
But what does that mean, Mike? I mean, should people worry that there's going to be flooding in that area? We have to explain this to millions of people. You're talking about models. Is it going to flood? What is your prediction?
Eventually, there is a risk that the reservoir releases will exceed channel capacity. It will not be as large as it was in early March with those storms.
But this week, the heat, then, we're not going to see more flooding?
No, not this week. Later into May.
Thank you.
This week, we would not expect to see Riverine flooding below the reservoirs.
Thanks, Mike. So our next question comes from Curtis Alexander with the San Francisco Chronicle. Go ahead, Curtis. Sorry, I muted you. You can unmute.
Hey, guys. Having spoken with some of the local agencies in the lake bed over the past couple of weeks, they've said that they're pretty happy about the state's help with modeling and the Fed's help with modeling, the floodwaters, and with the disaster follow-up. But they've also said that they could use some money. In one case, in the city of Corcoran, they don't have the money to raise their levy. They're short millions of dollars. Is there anything that the state can do to help them get that money and, protect themselves in case the floodwaters do come and overtake the current levy?
I can take a run at that. Hey, Curtis, good to hear from you. What I can share is there are a variety of programs available from both the state and federal government. So having that presidential disaster declaration makes a lot of resources available on the recovery side, and on the emergency management declaration from the federal government. That also opens up things for what we call emergency protective measures. And, one of the reasons our leaders have been down in the valley so frequently talking to the counties, and we'll just put up front that these are fairly small counties where their emergency management operation may, in some cases, be one person who also works for the fire department, is to kind of walk them through like what is the suite of programs you may be eligible for, and how do you pay for stuff. And I think what we can say is we are very committed to taking whatever action is necessary to protect lives and understanding not just that we need to raise the levee, but so the county or the local department wants to raise the levee at mile marker 52 by 3 feet, and to do that you would need this, and this as opposed to a check, right? And so working with them to get very specific on what the needs are. And there is actually a follow-up with the county specifically on Corcoran and the levee today to kind of drill down with them. There's a meeting on Friday that I mentioned before with the 200 emergency managers. There's a follow-up meeting with the county today to try to basically understand exactly what they need and connect them with the right federal program or state program. And there are several different programs that may be a good fit, but it's going to depend on what type of action that's happening. And it's a little bit more complicated because we are in some ways pre-disaster, right? And so anything during disaster, after disaster is covered by FEMA. And so, we want to do anything that's possible to help the locals, particularly if it protects infrastructure, if it protects lives. And so that work is happening now to try to problem solve and get to yes, and also help them if there's geoengineering or structural engineering that needs to happen, so we know like what type of mitigation measures need to be put in place. Maybe it's just raising the levee for a certain stretch of it. But those actions are happening. I think there's actually a meeting that's taking place this hour with the county to try to work with them. And I can also share that we've actually embedded Cal OES personnel in the emergency management offices of these 4 counties for the last month. And they'll continue there to basically help them figure out what is the form to send in, how do you submit these requests in a meaningful way that gets approved, because we don't want people waiting around figuring out FEMA forms to send in. What we want to do is get the aid there quickly to help protect the town and the infrastructure, and that's ongoing.
Thanks, Brian. Our next question comes from Tad Weber with the Fresno Bee. Go ahead.
Thank you. It's a follow-up essentially to what Curtis just asked, and that is, does the state in its modeling, does the state foresee any levee failures and flooding of Corcoran?
So at this time, we haven't had a request by Kings County to model any particular levee failures with the Corcoran levee. And really the way that process works is the county communicates with the state and makes a request for potential modeling of a scenario.
I think it'd be fair just to add on that while we have this amazing technology and science, and we're very lucky to have a full-time state climatologist like Dr. Anderson working on it, there's many factors that we don't know yet, right? Like what levee may have groundhogs in it that may have made it more at risk than other parts. What is the precipitation, what is the cloud cover going to look like? And so while we're using the best available science to try to map this, there will still be factors that are beyond our control. And so while we want to plan for as many of these eventualities as possible, there will still need to be emergency protective measures that happen as the weather shifts, or as we understand risks that happen. If there's a failure at one part of the levee upstream that maybe you aren't anticipating, that could change the calculus, right? And we want to use this period of time to take the steps now to understand what perhaps are the series of challenges. But there will always be things that are beyond our control. But what we want to do is take as many of those factors off the table as possible, and then also give as much power, authority, control to the people who are directly on the ground helping the communities. So whether it's additional personnel from the state, we talked about pre-positioning earlier today. So can we move more firefighters or National Guards people into the region? Can we bring in more super sacks or other debris to help shore up the levee one place? And so we want to use this to take action now. And so, it probably isn't possible for anyone on this call to definitively say, yes, Corcoran will flood, no, it won't flood. But what we want to do is take every available action to try to make sure it doesn't. And if God forbid it does, we are able to understand what that looks like and how we get as many people out in as safe a way as possible.
Thanks, Brian. Our next question, we're going to go to Mark Prater. You can unmute.
Hi, it's Mark. It's Prater.
Sorry, Mark.
I'm with Visalia Hanford Lemoore Future newspaper. So, you guys are doing a great job being proactive. I can see that, but it's only one facet of the problem. I've tried to look at the financial impact on the southern side of Joaquin Valley. All I'm getting from the insurance companies, well, first of all, they're not even answering. You're getting the Insurance Institute and then a little bit of a response from FEMA. But it occurs to me that there ought to be some kind of briefing that really discusses the overall picture, including the financial impact from the flooding. Because if what you're saying is true and predicted, it's going to be an enormous financial burden on the state and individuals. So I just wondering if you could address that a little bit, if there's a way to bring in other agencies to bring us up to date on what the models are for financial impact from all this flooding.
I take a run at that. Mark, thank you. And we agree, right? And so, maybe we could have a follow-up with perhaps our colleagues from USDA and FEMA and some of those to kind of walk through, or maybe the insurance commissioner's office too. While some of that's speculative, we were thinking about many of the same challenges. And, there is actually people in several of these counties can go right now and sign up for small business assistance through the U.S. Small Business Administration, and that's available now. And then, but certainly there will be significant impacts still to come. And so how do we, try to understand what those are? I know our colleagues, Department of Finance, are very interested in that from a state budget perspective and lost revenue, but also from a human perspective in terms of what that means to many of the folks who make their livelihood in this region, and how can we support them? So, we'll take that for action to maybe have a more specific ag and finance related briefing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Our next question comes from Jim Guy at the Fresno Bee. Go ahead.
Yeah, could Mr. Anderson or somebody else there elaborate on the Millerton situation, and also FID, Fresno Irrigation District, getting additional pumps? What's that all about? Could you elaborate on that?
I will let Paul talk about the pumps. I can tell you about Lake Millerton. So we've seen another big runoff years, 2019, 2017. If we get into a warm spell, there may be a week or two where the reservoir will operate its gates to release water. They do their best to keep it within the channel capacities downstream, but sometimes the releases may have to exceed that. Maybe instead of 8,000, it may be upwards of 10,000 CFS.
Thank you. And I'll address the temporary pump program. As I mentioned, we've been coordinating with local water managers on diversions, and a lot of them do have pumps and diversions for their recharge basins. But what we found was that they've reached their capacity with what pumps they've had, but they could divert more, including some newer recharge basins that don't have infrastructure. So what we established was a temporary pump program where through our state contracts, we're able to coordinate and contract with local water agencies to for them to be able to rent additional pumps to be able to do additional diversions. And Fresno Irrigation District was the first one that we were able to get contracted, and I believe they got their pumps and are going to be operational this afternoon. We have a number of other agencies in Tulare Lake who are looking to take advantage of this, and we're working real closely to help them. So one, it's just, us providing assistance for additional pump capacity for them to increase diversions off the rivers and streams.
Thanks, Paul. Our next question comes from Esteban Reynoso. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you guys for setting all this up. So what I'm a little bit curious about was part of my story today is about the snowmelt. So I just wanted to see if we could talk a little bit more about that, either if Dr. Anderson doesn't mind going into further detail just on what it means when you do have this, 10, 11 degree, this big jump in temperatures in the mountains especially, and just kind of what it means for the water that's going to be coming into the dams, going into the rivers. Obviously, it's a big question, but, how impactful is it when you have 95 hitting the valley this week, and what it means for later on down in the week?
What we look at when we see the big spike in temperatures is what we'll look at are those minimum temperatures where we find the elevation where you get freezing and the refreezing, which kind of slows down the melt. As long as the nighttime temperatures are staying above freezing, the water can still move through the system and work its way to the rivers and downstream. The melt of the pack itself happens when we have those daylight hours and the sun shining on it to really have that solar radiation change the structure of snow into liquid. So what we'll expect to see is we'll expect to see the volumes pick up, and we work with our friends at the National Weather Service California Nevada River Forecast Center. And what we're looking at with reservoir inflows, we're kind of expecting them to about double over the course of the week. So running from, say, 6,000 cubic feet per second for the larger rivers, say like the Merced River, up to about 12,000 CFS inflow. And what that'll do is you'll look at, see with the space they have, how they manage the flows at the reservoirs, and that's with our friends at the Corps of Engineers. We'll look at the space they have available to manage how long the pulse warm spell lasts to see if they need to make increased releases into the downstream regions. So it's a lot of folks working together to really get all that information lined up and manage the melt as we go.
Thanks, Mike. Our next question comes from Tom Bakar with KTVU News. Go ahead.
I'm curious about something because I find it's great that we have amazing technology and service, as someone said. But how can you not possibly know the number of acres that are covered in water? Because that seems to me to be the most basic thing of all. And I realize that depth has a lot to do with it. To not know how big the flood is at this particular point in time seems to be pretty hard to determine where it's going to go. Well, how can this number be so unknown?
Well, it's not that it's unknown. I just don't have it off the top of my head. I can go downstairs when we're done here and talk with our GIS team. We'll grab the daily satellite shot, and they can estimate the number of acres inundated from that.
So what was the 300,000 feet about? 300,000 acres?
That was from earlier when we were experiencing the extreme flooding earlier in the year.
So that's not a correct number?
Not for now. That is right. It is not a correct number for now.
And Mike, just a point of clarification, it was a correct number at a point in time previously. It is not
just the correct number for today.
Right. And we will get that correct number and get it out there.
Is it bigger or smaller? Does anybody know?
Mike, do you?
Not off the top of my head.
All right, we'll get back to you as in addition to everybody else who's asked the question. Okay, our next question comes from Rich Ibarra at Capital Public Radio. Go ahead, Rich.
I had a question regarding the San Joaquin, Sacramento Delta, especially with regards to during the winter months when the levels are high, the winds are coming up. You see a lot of levee failures in that region. And of course, it's also affected by the tides. What about in May? What do you think the situation will be like?
So with the snowmelt, we tend to have lower flows than during the winter rains where you have a much larger volume of water entering the delta. With the snowmelt, it tends to be a much more localized issue. And as I mentioned, those are responded to as the folks that are out patrolling the levees identify an issue, they report it back and a response measure is taken.
So will the delta levees be more at risk or not?
Less risk than the wintertime extremes. Those areas that have water on the levees face issues with water being on the levees, and it depends on the location as to what issues they face, be it seepage, erosion.
All right, thanks, Mike. Let's. We've only got time for one more question. We are about near our end here, so we are going to go to Alyssa Starr with ABC News. Go ahead.
Hi, guys. If I'm hearing this all correctly, it seems like, at least for this week and next, you feel pretty optimistic you're not going to see significant flooding. But some climate scientists have already said this week is the big melt. So do communities like Allensworth or Alpa or even just Tulare and Kings County in general have to be worried? I mean, it seems like flooding is coming this week or this weekend. Is there anything further you can say about that?
Yeah, I can say that because the melt picks up again because you have reservoir management, that mitigates the consequences downstream. Alpi, Allensworth are further away from the lake bed. They faced flooding earlier in the season from the lower elevation rain-driven systems, not from the higher elevation watersheds that have a snowpack that have reservoirs, managing that release into the downstream system. Again, we're dealing with a melt, and it will accelerate this week, but it's not going to accelerate to such a rate that everything falls apart right now.
But then can I just follow up? Does that mean that you don't think communities need to worry about being evacuated as early as this week, this weekend, early next week?
Not due to excessive snowmelt. Anytime there are water on levees and a community is protected by a levee, the levee needs, there are patrols that look for any issues that may crop up on the levee.
Ferguson, do you want to speak to that?
I was going to say, Alyssa, to the extent it's helpful, there's about 650 people currently under an evacuation warning or evacuation order, which is held steady for the last several weeks. These numbers come from the local county sheriffs, who are the ones who ultimately make the determination on it, which is, again, one of the reasons we met with them last week to talk about it. Certainly we never leave anything to chance and want to understand, if there's a need to evacuate, to get the warnings and notifications out earlier rather than later. Without putting words in Dr. Anderson's mouth, I think it'd be fair to say that slow and steady is the name of the game. We've been fairly lucky so far with the pace of the water. We hope to keep it that way. But it's always important for Californians to understand their risk, and certainly folks who live in this region, we'd encourage them to sign up for emergency alerts so they can get notifications from their counties, to go to our Cal Alerts webpage where you can find that information. We can also have maps there where people can determine if they live in a known or existing floodplain. And so, like that personal preparedness is always a critical part of this. And, people are, in many cases, the hardest thing to control during a disaster. We can build levees, we can drive, high water vehicles and work with the sheriffs and send out wireless alerts, but human behavior is so often the thing that is hardest to mitigate. And so, for everyone who lives in this region, first and foremost, we are with them and we need to support them, but we want them to take actions now, whether it's making a family emergency plan, understanding their evacuation routes, and if told to evacuate by the sheriff, not hesitating and, getting out immediately. And together, we're going to try to get through this by saving lives.
Thanks, Brian. Our absolute last final question goes to Haley Smith at the LA Times. Go ahead, Haley.
Thank you. Mike, I just wanted to push a little bit more on that, because if I'm hearing you correctly, you have said a few times no riverine flooding until May, but the National Weather Service is predicting now that the Merced is going to flood inside Yosemite National Park this week. I think Thursday night is what their prediction is. So are you just not considering that because it's inside a national park, or am I just kind of misunderstanding the nature of your comments?
Yeah. So the CNRFC has made note that by Friday, Yosemite River at Pohono Bridge, which is above Exchequer Dam, so it's in the upper watershed, will reach its flood stage. And that's why the park has to take some actions closing one of the trails because there'll be water on the trail. That is a different situation than down on the valley floor below the reservoirs.
So you're saying the difference you're saying is that because this is upstream as opposed to downstream below the dams?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Anderson. And with that, if you have additional questions or you need clarifications on anything discussed today, please submit those questions to media@water.ca.gov. And thanks to everyone who participated today, and we will talk to you all soon. Thanks so much. Have a great day.